Hello, everybody. We are beginning to see folks arrive. We had over 300 people RSVP for this event, which is so far our biggest event at community.fluent.pet. I think we may be straining the capabilities of the Circle platform we are operating on. It's so great to see everybody here. I'd like to welcome Kelly, Irma, and Calvin, who will be in the background acting as moderators within the chat. I'm very excited to give a warm welcome to Doctors Joanna Lambert, Jeff Reed, who, along with Alexis, will be graciously answering all of our curious and slightly naive questions about how dogs communicate. So I'd very much like to welcome you both. I'll first introduce myself. I'm Leo Trace, founder, CEO of Fluent Pet. Alexis?
I am Alexis Devine, co-founder of Fluent Pet and dog mom to Bunny the talking dog. Joanna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, guys, for inviting me. And thank you to all of the audience that's out there. My name is Joanna Lambert. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I study animal behavior. I've studied behavior of different species around the world, mostly endangered species. And now I'm working with canids in the American West, so namely gray wolves and coyotes.
Dr. Reed, go ahead.
Just call me Jeff, Leo.
All right, Jeff.
Hello, everybody. And like Joanna said, thank you for being here. I am Jeff Reed. I was raised in Paradise Valley. I like to call it the real Paradise Valley, not the one on the TV show, where I grew up just north of Yellowstone National Park. I'm a research affiliate and a technology specialist for what's called the Cry Wolf Project, the bioacoustic study of wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. My PhD involved computational linguistics, and I spent a long time in the tech world. And now I live back in my childhood area of Montana, just north of Yellowstone. I grew up before wolves were introduced, during, and then after. My linguistics degree is focused on wolves and animal communication in general, but in particular wolves.
Jeff and I met in Yellowstone years ago, and the two projects that we're working on, namely with Jeff, his Cry Wolf project, and then mine, sort of under the broad rubric of American Canid, is about domestication and specifically testing hypotheses of how to get this from a wolf, and testing those hypotheses with wild animals. So the kind of complementarity in the work we are both engaged in is a natural fit.
It's such a delight to have you both here. Jeff, you and I met back at the Santa Fe Institute at an event sponsored by the Interspecies Internet Crew. That's the group started by Vince Cerf, Peter Gabriel, Diana Reese, and Neil Gershenfeld. Over a decade ago, they launched it in a TED Talk, hosting events to foster the development of what they're calling an interspecies internet, a way to get the rest of the species on this planet connected. So that was an amazing event. Jeff, you and I got to talking, and we had a lot of really interesting conversations about wolf communication and what Alexis's dog is able to do, and what thousands, maybe now hundreds of thousands of people have been able to witness from their own dog when it comes to kind of using buttons and, the hex file system in order to communicate. Very excited that we could make this get together happen. Alexis, I guess you've got the first question.
I do, and it's for Joanna. I'm wondering if you could give us a brief overview of how dogs evolved from wolves.
I'm a professor, so we have a tendency to go on and on. I teach a course here at University of Colorado called Dogs, Wolves, and Evolution, and I have 3 months to tell that story. Right now, I just have a couple of minutes. So I think the first thing to just keep in mind is that deep and long history that humans have had with gray wolves, essentially for as long as modern humans have lived in the Northern Hemisphere, which is anywhere from about 30 to 70,000 years, depending on what part of the world, we had pioneered landscapes with gray wolves, right? And at the time, in deep time, there would have been multiple species of wolves that we would have been sharing landscapes with. An interesting cooperative relationship started to form between gray wolves and humans. That idea of cooperation and working in coordination, and then especially in this this bigger picture of coevolution is maybe the heart of how you get a dog from a wolf. Essentially, roughly 35,000 years ago, some wolves figured out that hanging around humans yielded access to resources that otherwise might not have been available. So scavenging at big game sites, right? Humans are good big game hunters. And through time, this relationship of some wolves hanging around humans, and then humans realizing that having some of those wolves around was beneficial. So the wolves were getting access to food resources. Humans were getting access to a really vigilant predator that could alarm in the face of other predators coming around. Through this self-selected process, it was those wolves that were the most pro-social, right? That and the least timid that were approaching humans. Humans, in the meanwhile, weren't letting those wolves come in that might not be as pro-social. So there was clearly both partners engaged in that relationship through time. And I won't get into all of the genetic mechanisms, but through time, given this deep time, 30,000 years, beginning to see shifts in aspects of the genome or the genetics of dogs, so that by the time we get to around 30-ish thousand years ago, there are features of the skull that look dog-like, right? And then intensive selective breeding doesn't really occur until much later in time. And as most of your audience members are fully aware, some of our breeds today are only very, very recent. But the basic stuff of a domesticated version of a gray wolf, somewhere between, say, maybe 10, ish thousand years old plus. And we know that from archaeological evidence. We know that from genomic and genetic evidence. Yeah. So that's maybe the short story. I'll be fleshing out aspects of that throughout our time together.
That is so, go ahead. That's what I was going to say too.
Wow.
Go figure. So I heard this, and it might be a myth. Is it true that wolves, in addition to just like eating scraps, were also feces cleaner uppers?
And that has been proposed, right? And we do know that our microbiome of the lower digestive tract shares a lot in common with domesticated dogs, for sure. So that has indeed been part of the story. There are all kinds of other aspects of the story that are told about cooperative hunting. And again, I'm sure that'll come out in various ways throughout the rest of our time together. But anybody that spent time watching wolves hunt know that they do it in a very coordinated way, right? With individuals playing different roles in a hunt. Many folks have seen this in the northern part of Yellowstone National Park, arguably the best place to see wild wolves. And what we know from our own evolutionary history is that occupied this space of being a big game hunter. And in order to bring down animals like woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, etc., you need to be coordinated. It needs to be a cooperative endeavor. So there remains a lot of similarities in terms of how prey are taken down. It requires groups, right? Groups of humans or packs of wolves, right? It involves individual roles that are being played and maybe have a vanguard, and others are, are playing other roles in the back. Maybe there's one individual that either has the spear or, in the case of wolves, has the killing bite. There are a lot of similarities there, and it has been that kind of cooperative behavior mapped on very closely early on.
That's so cool. So that must mean that there were sort of some key moments wherein we started to see some radical changes in how wolves were communicating amongst themselves and with humans.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave a lot of that to Jeff. Studying this intensively, I could talk a lot about some of the inter-individual elements of dog-human behaviors and communications that are clearly the product of evolution. Right, that we are engaged in communicative fears that we are not engaged.
Jeff, how would you say dog communication is similar to or different from wolf communication?
Two simple examples are dogs bark more and wolves howl more. We want our dogs to bark at the mailman. So we select for that behavior. Wolves only bark when it's a real threat. When they do bark, it's either at another human or another wolf from a rival pack. And sometimes at another threat, maybe like a grizzly bear. And conversely, I haven't met a domestic dog species that doesn't howl as a puppy. I've yet to come across one, including Chihuahuas. They will howl as puppies. So a wolf pup will howl within roughly 20 days from birth. So they're howling very young. And of course, many dogs breeds continue to howl into older age. Not all of them. A lot of them, for obvious reasons, they're not part of a pack. And a howl is a long distance communication, right, between pack mates. And so if you're taking a dog and kind of keeping it in your house, there's really no reason to howl a lot. But we all know that dogs will howl at sirens, or certain dogs will. And what's interesting about a howl is it starts at a low pitch, goes to a higher pitch, and then tails off into a lower pitch howl. And what's interesting about a siren is the siren does the same thing. It starts low, goes high, and drops, but it's a much higher pitch than a typical wolf howl. And my working hypothesis is that dogs are most likely responding to puppies howling when they hear a siren because it's a higher. And lots of species, including us, are keyed into young making those higher pitched vocalizations that they make because of their vocal apparatus. So it's something to keep in mind in the simplest differences between dogs and wolves.
I'm just going to just throw this in there, Jeff. We've discussed this in several contexts. What was it that happened? It was either last night or the night before. And what alerted you to it?
What happened? Well, I live just about 10 miles north of Yellowstone on the Yellowstone River, and I heard my dogs. In fact, I'm listening to them right now, wondering what's going on. I'm really tuned into barks, and I'm like, this is not a normal bark. I opened my door, walked outside, and I'm like 10 feet from the river. There was a grizzly bear about 25 yards away, and my English setter was circling this bear. I called them back in. They have collars on. It reminded me that certain dog species, like terriers and dachshunds, have different types of barks for different prey that they hunt with humans for, like boar and partridge and fox. And wolves most likely have at least three different types of barks, ones that are directed at humans, some that are directed at other packs, and some that are directed at their own pack mates. And so when you start tuning into and barks are really hard for humans because they're short, but for dogs who really know their own culture, they can tune into those different types of barks. So yeah, if you start listening to your dog bark, you might get a cue on what they're barking at.
And I think what is fascinating in an uncanny sort of coincidence is saying that Jeff had a grizzly on his porch. I had a mountain lion on my porch. And my dog, not this one, my other dog, alerted me to the fact that there was something not typically around. Anyone that has lived with, one or more of their dogs for a long time can recognize that's not the bark that I normally hear. When I'm in Colorado, I get black bear coming by and mountain lion. When I'm in Montana, grizzly bear. I rely on firefly. I am very tuned in to the signaling going on. I bring this up because it illustrates part of why humans would ever let wolves and then eventually proto dog and then eventually dog hang around, right? That is exceptionally useful attribute, right? If you are getting alerted to the fact that there's a predator around, potentially different kinds of vocalizations, and we know this in other species, this certainly happens, that the vocalization is tuned into the specific predator itself. That is extremely functional. And evolutionary biologists often think about these behaviors in terms of the ultimate function.
Yeah. Dogs didn't need to be our friends to be a good alarm system. They could have stayed 20, 30 feet away from everybody the entire time.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I was wondering, how did things get closer together? What was the gradual ramp? That's a really interesting proposal. Jeff, you mentioned something about a device that you're recording wolves with. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are devices for everybody. Most of you probably camera trap or seen videos of camera traps with wildlife. But there are also acoustic recorders, which is like a camera trap, except it takes sound. And we can record 24/7, 365 across the landscape with a lot of data to record, and then use AI to go back and find certain types of species that we're interested in, like wolves, and start patterning their behavior in a wild setting where it would be impossible to stay up all day and all night and listen to how they talk. So you can buy these yourself. They're getting down to like a few bucks for just an everyday one, and record, your neighbor's dog coming over and barking in your backyard if you want. That's how we study wildlife, is with these acoustic recorders. We put them out. And a wolf howl is very loud. It's about 100 decibels, which is the equivalent of you standing in front of your car and someone honking the horn for 5 minutes in your ears right there, about 10 feet away. So it travels far, and they're low frequencies. We can pick them up 6 to 8 kilometers away from a recorder, hearing a wolf howl. You don't need as many acoustic recorders as you need camera traps to study a landscape.
When dogs and wolves cohabitate, what does their communication look like?
Yeah, there's some good studies on that. More interestingly, wolves and coyotes are often in the same context where wolves exist, and they do not ignore each other. And you'd think a wolf or a coyote would ignore a wolf, because wolves kill coyotes easily. And coyotes just don't shut up. Like, they're always going off. And wolves will respond to coyotes. I've seen them 100 yards apart and yapping back and forth. What's interesting about dogs is about 50% of the time a dog will respond to a wolf. It's more likely a dog would be nearby coyotes, but they will respond with some barking. And 50% of the time they don't. And we don't know why, but it's a different behavioral response to a canid that a dog's experiencing. So they're a little more quiet, apprehensive. It could be the personality of the dog. It could be a lot of things that really hasn't been studied before. So that's, there are some good studies showing that roughly 50% of the time a dog will just shut up, and other times they'll be barking away.
Interesting. Is that when they're living together, or specifically when there's a wolf outside a home where a dog is living?
To be clear, I'm talking about in a natural environment where coyotes are occupying, and that could be an urban center as well. There are very few, like what you would call a truly wild wolf, that would live within a domestic environment. You wouldn't want one to, because your house would be destroyed, number one. But there are rescue centers where there's a captive facility where wolves are around. And I've never seen a study of what do the people who run that dogs do with those wolves. I think they're going to probably be a little more habituated to one another than in a wild setting. But it's a good question.
I have a friend and colleague here in Colorado, Darlene Kaboble, who runs the Colorado Wolf and Wildlife Center, which is a quite extraordinary place. I had the extraordinary experience of a group howl of, it was gray wolves, including Mexican gray wolves, plus red wolves, plus coyotes. And here's the twist: Papua New Guinea singing dogs. No one's quite sure what to do with Papua New Guinea singing dogs in terms of how to lump them in their evolutionary history with regard to domestication, but they all howled together. And it was a gray wolf that set it off, right? So this would be literally a situation of not the sympatry or living in the same landscape like Jeff was describing, but it's a situation where this is a captive center, right? And so all these animals are in adjacent cages. And in this case, it was a gray wolf that's just started a low, long, loud call, what we call a howl. And then every one of those other subspecies and species chimed right in. It was extraordinary. It was loud, and it went on. And I was so enraptured by the whole thing that I failed to record. That was my bad that I didn't record that. Sorry, Jeff.
That is so cool. Do you have a suspicion about, like, the wolf started howling? Did the then New Guinea singing dog start howling because it wanted to communicate with other singing dogs to say there's a threat, there's a wolf howling? Or do you think it was like a direct response to the howl of the wolf.
I've been working with a lot of my graduate students who are studying gray wolves in different areas, and we've been working on something called an ethogram, putting together a behavioral repertoire with descriptors, right? And something that I say to my students a lot is, at this point, we don't know the motivation of that individual animal. We may know that after many months of coming to know that individual. We're able to come up with well-educated hypotheses as to the function or the motivation. But currently, all we know is the description of that behavior, right? I feel like in that setting, as a scientist, I can't say what the individual, and we call this sort of behavioral state, right, of an individual animal. I don't know what the emotional or behavioral state of that animal was or individual motivation. What I can say is that I can describe it. The Papua New Guinea singing dogs were the last ones to chime in. The idea you put out was it may be like, whoa, everybody's going off and we better be vigilant and responsive. Or maybe it was like, this is an individual motivation. Like, and everyone's doing it. I want to do it too. I wouldn't want to interpret the behavior, but through time, hopefully given enough examples, we can start to say something. And that's what Jeff is doing at Yellowstone. I've also got a graduate student working on some of this stuff in Yellowstone. Initially, you can describe those behaviors, but if you get enough of it through time and enough context, you can start to say something with more assurance.
It's probably worth calling out. One of the reasons we decided to do this is not because of you, Leo. Well, because of Alexa. Conversation Leo and I had, which is like what you're doing with float is grabbing behavior that might give us a better clue on intention and communication. Because that's really tough in the wild. You're often making things up. It might be true, but how can you prove it? And then we also talked about the N400 studies, and you have a really important person on your advisory board, I believe. We're showing that dogs do have a neural response to vocalizations. And that's the closest we're probably going to get to. Do they have some linguistic capability that is intentional and is not? I get kind of fed up with the biologists sometimes where they're always talking about emotional state. And I'm like, well, I communicate emotionally all the time. And whether it's intentional or it's driven by hormones, I don't really care. It's communication driven off of behavior. And so those 100 studies are going to show us a lot that we can at least use to have hypotheses about wild animals that are more what I call intentional. Like biologists really steer away from things like intentional. Emotional state is okay, but intentionality is not. But I think some of those N400 studies are important. And then the button studies are going to be very important as well.
How has human interaction with wolves impacted the way they communicate with each other?
I wouldn't at this point in time and make a statement about humans on land and then wolves on land in those same landscapes now, right? How one species is affecting the other. I guess how I would want to respond to that question is as an evolutionary biologist, which is what I am, right? I'm an evolutionary biologist that studies behavior in the wild. I think that maybe I don't know, maybe the safest way to respond to that, because it's always we'll never know, right? But what we can do is look at the product of those behavioral or communication shifts in a domesticated dog versus a gray wolf. We can begin to say something about what the evolutionary pressure might have been early on with regards to communication, because now we know that this little guy in the way is very different than, and here I'm going to use my props, this is a wolf here, the way that I would communicate with this wolf for the now deceased, obviously. And that is that there are elements of our behavior now, and anybody that lives with a dog knows this, right? How attuned they are to elements of our voice, whether it's deep or whether it's light, high and excited. What we're doing with outpoints, as that's classic work by Brian Hare and others, of course, and so significance of the eye gaze. This little guy is new to me. I just rescued him. And he and I are engaged in a communication that is absolutely a product of evolution, right? It's something that's been called gaze related dopamine reward. I look at this little guy, I that like it feel good in my brain, and he does the same thing. We just keep looking at each other like a mom would with her baby. So, in terms, I'll let Jeff respond to the question of how might the presence of humans influence gray wolves now in terms of their behavior, communication behavior. I'll answer with that kind of through time, what happened and what are those shifts.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to look a gray wolf in the eye. In fact, you would do the opposite, right? You'd look away if you wanted to have some sort of interaction. One of the cool things about some of the modern tech, like acoustic recorders, is you can place those across different landscapes. There's a good study that did it in Yellowstone, Minnesota, in Spain, and in India. And so you can imagine the density of humans across those different landscapes are different, right? More dense in India than less in Spain, less in Minnesota and less in Yellowstone. And the short is that wolves howl less in India than they do in Yellowstone. Yellowstone has a really reasonable study that shows how human presence impacts wolves. The flip side to that could be that wolves are talking to us as much as we like to things. They're really talking to other wolves. And so a different question is asked, how do wolves behave when more wolves are in their territory? They're very territorial, and the number one killer of wolves in Yellowstone are other wolves. Outside of the park, it's humans, but inside the park, it's other wolves. What we found is that when there's a higher density of wolf packs, they're going to chorus howl more often because they're setting up their territory and communicating that way. So what may be going on in India is that they're chorus howling less because there aren't as many wolves. But it is an interesting study for conservation because there are these things called rad boxes that are just speakers that play back in livestock scenarios. So if you're trying to protect livestock from wolves, you play back sounds. And usually people play.
We've got like an audio issue with your mic. Maybe if you muted and unmuted or something, it might go away.
How's that?
Oh, yeah.
Where did I lose you, Leo?
Oh, we could hear it. It was just, there was distortion.
So one of the things we're trying to do is use playbacks on speakers to deter wolves from livestock, which would then promote coexistence and prevent ranchers from losing cattle. Right now, people play a lot of AC/DC, Def Leppard, firecrackers, that sort of stuff. What I'm trying to say is that might not be the best sound to play to a wolf that you're trying to keep away from an area. Yes, you want to play human anthropogenic sounds because they are afraid of humans, but maybe a gunshot's better. And then couple that with wolves chorus howling because then they know that another pack is in the area. And that's just as risky to them as the human. But it's a great question. Hopefully I gave you some examples of how our influence on them can affect their chorus howling, and then how we can use that, science for conservation.
So, Jeff, are there any sort of common misconceptions about how wolves communicate that you would like to dispel here?
One is there is a myth that wolves don't howl around their dens. So when they give birth, people thought they're not going to howl as much around the den because it's going to give away the den site. They howl all the time at their den sites. So that's a misconception that some people have had. And there's also been some studies saying they howl more in the daytime during breeding season, which is roughly January through March. But no one sat up all night for a year and wrote down when wolves howl the most. So with these acoustic recorders, we've done a long-term study over multiple years, and we've shown that they howl all the time at night, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., dusk, dawn. So they're very vocal at night. And for all I know, that's how we got the myth of werewolves howling at the moon. They have the lunar cycle has zero impact on wolves howling. They do not howl at the moon when it's a full moon. They just howl constantly at night. And so those are a couple misconceptions about their communication patterns.
And do you find the howls are primarily long distance, like speaking to other pack members, or is there something else to it?
They do a lot of short range howling that we never hear, maybe only traveling
Ooh.
500 yards. In fact, those are the most interesting because they sound like Chewbacca. It's like an alien talking. They frequently howl within close quarters. And if you think of a pack, don't just all huddle up in one communal bed at night. They're kind of spread out across the landscape. So there's this constant keeping in contact, like birds do with contact calls. I'm here, I'm here, oh, I'm here, I'm here. And they're not that loud howl we're familiar with that I described with the car horn. So they do howl a lot in close quarters. They seem to do that mostly at night as well.
So interesting. Any chance you want to demo the Chewbacca howl for us?
No, absolutely not. I will.
Okay.
We might close with a group howl, but if you go to our Languages of Life YouTube channel, there's some good examples of close range howls that I've got two wolves talking back and forth like two Chewbaccas. It's fascinating to listen to because it sounds much more like speech than a classic howl.
Amazing. Would love to hear that.
Well, I think you touched on one of these other questions we have for you. Did you want to say anything more about the amazing technology that you're using to study wolves, Jeff?
No, I've found people are bored with technology. When I talk about it too much, people are just bored. I think people want to know the most common question I get is, do wolves talk? And my answer is always yes, no, and maybe. It all comes down to how you define perhaps the least understood word of all, which is language. But yes, I think they talk, and they have 20 different vocalizations or more, including teeth clacking. So they make a lot of vocalizations you could call a word like most people aren't familiar with. They're I hate to say this, but they're more talkative than a dog is. And they're maybe a little more educated at Cambridge or Oxford than a dog when it comes to language. But I love my dogs.
Great. Thanks for that. Alexis, did you have a question?
Yeah. Have you noticed that there are any environmental factors like territory size or pack dynamics that influence how wolves communicate?
Yeah, I'll start with kind of the big picture, ecological, evolutionary aspects of that. And then Jeff can come in with some of the most recent data that the Cry Wolf Project has been coming up with. It's important to just keep in mind that there are many aspects of when we say environment that influence how animals are communicating, right? And so I spent literally decades studying wild primates, great apes, and various primate species in closed canopy forests in equatorial Africa and Asia. That setting is very different than, say, high latitude Alaska, where we find Arctic wolves and other species where just the acoustic circumstances are really different, right? So that part of it will be just like the acoustic landscape that you're in. So that's the climate and, the physical structure. And then the total number of other species in that same landscape who are also making a lot of noise, right? And we do know competition for free time or available time to make a sound so you can be heard. Where there are a lot of other species, like in the tropics, there can be hundreds of species vocalizing at the same time. Then you get this kind of temporal partitioning, right? Like, okay, I'm going to do my thing first thing in the morning before, such and such other species is even woken up. And so total number of other species, the physical, and then the total number of other animals of your species and how that might influence whether you are or are not going to be heard. Total number of other animals of your species and how far away they are, right? If there's one pack of wolves in a very, very high latitude, remote region of northern Alaska, the nearest pack might be tens, if not hundreds of miles away. So the communication might be very much oriented to other pack members, right? There are a number of influencing variables on that.
Fascinating. Are there moments where you see the wolves like trying to maintain silence, like during a hunt, or I mean, are there specific moments where there are fewer howls based on a specific circumstance?
I can say with authority about a number of species when there are hunts or interterritorial disputes that are going on, it could go either way. You know, we're coming for you, right? We are loud, but for the most part, many animals are much more quiet, right? Across species in the case of territorial disputes. And Jeff, have your data thus far been able to reveal?
I think it's the most fascinating thing we figure out in the next 10 years is if you think about a wolf howl can, let's say, travel 6 kilometers, and I have evidence where I know wolves who have heard their chorus howl from 8 miles away, where I couldn't hear it, but they could. So their sensitivity might be better than ours. If that's the range, and you're a wolf, you grow up in that culture and you learn that. Wolves often go off on their own for hunting forays, especially a dominant male. We see them split off from the pack and they'll travel 20 miles, right? Because they're trying to find food. And at what point, and we also know wolves know that other wolves are dangerous, right? They've seen death. So at what point do you know you're so far away from your pack that they're not going to hear you? Why would you howl that could bring in another wolf? The great researchers at Yellowstone who never get enough credit, they're going to do a study using bioacoustic loggers on collars this winter. Wolves will have a recorder on the collar, and then it'll also know the GPS location of that wolf. And we'll start figuring out, do they howl when they're 10 miles away from the pack? I've seen a wolf about 5 kilometers away from the den site where the rest of the pack was. This wolf was 5 miles away, and the pack gave a chorus howl, and it didn't move. It just kept doing what it was doing. And then they gave another chorus howl an hour later. It didn't move. And then they gave a third chorus howl, and that wolf beeline straight back to the den. At the same time, the pack that was at the den left. So if there's something in that signal that indicated to that wolf that I need to go back to the den and do my job of protecting the pups with the alpha female, those are the sorts of things in an animal that communicates at long range. Like humans used to use whistle languages a lot to communicate at distance. We used to use smoke signals to communicate at a distance. Now we're talking over digital formats. We only communicate in close range, even though we invented things that allow us to communicate at a distance. Wolves have to communicate over a big landscape, and the environment definitely impacts. Good sound people know that lots of foliage, lots of trees will impact vocalization patterns and pitches and frequency in animals. So we're just scratching the surface of that question of how a wolf in a dense forest might communicate differently than a wolf on an open landscape.
I think that takes us to question from the audience. Q&A session. Alexis, have you gotten any
Yeah.
teed up? All right.
I have all sorts of audience questions. So got one from Allison here. Allison asks, I wonder if humans began using that siren pattern because of wolves and other species howling. Do we know where our siren patterns originated?
As an off.
In my bucket list, Allison, there's 3 sounds. Some siren, there are different types of sirens, right? But there's a pattern of a siren that has a noisy bandwidth, which is easier to pick up some signal from, depending upon environmental factors. And then there's the length of it, right? Maybe give you a little more chance to know that that's like not just background noise. I highly doubt that the British, I'm sure it was the Brits, and Joanna the Brit, she should know the answer, invented that siren because of wolves, or maybe. I don't know. It's a good question. Why don't you write a PhD on it?
We very quickly figure out as humans what does and does not work. Some of us may be better than others, but in terms of communication, as I mentioned previously, for many years, I literally lived in a closed canopy rainforest, and I was always out, each day. And there, I very quickly learned that there were certain vocalizations that I made that my field technician or field assistant could never hear. Like a whistle was useless, right? That kind of high frequency just very, very quickly dissipates, right? But I learned through time won't do it. It's loud, like long, low, like whoop. And so I came up with a way of communicating with my field technicians in a close rainforest, a whole series of whoops, right? So whoop, 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 like help, whoop, whoop, where are you? So we you get that feedback very quickly. And then there are just bioacoustic qualities of some sounds that do better in some settings than in others. And certainly sirens get everybody's attention.
I think repetition is one that most people don't talk about. And wolves do this repetitive howl that's a shorter howl. We think it's mostly in distress context. And I'd be interested to see, like, I'm sure some of you on this video have had your dog keep pushing the button, right? Just keep going, repetition. And so repetition is another way to communicate information, like Joanna said, and not just the frequency or pitch of the sound.
Ellen asks, howling is more common with scent hounds and less common, say, with herding breeds. Each follow a broken part of the stalk, chase, kill. How does the howl baying scent hound differ from wolves?
Jeff can get into the bioacoustic elements of that. We had very clearly engaged in selective breeding for our highly specialized breeds. That was a situation where there's an endemic foundational behavior already in dogs being essentially the same species as wolves, and then certain kinds of behaviors being selected through animal husbandry, right? You breed the individual dog that has the best, loudest braying versus those that don't make as much ruckus, and you can really select on it. How it relates bioacoustically to a howl, Jeff can.
It's very similar. Like a bay is a howl, but you never get a wolf running and howling at the same time because of rates, and you never get a hound doing a long duration bay. It's, more like a bark, right? But it's the frequency is very similar to what a howl would be like. It's just shorter and more repetitive. And then when they tree something, they switch to a little more like a bark. But and to Joanna's point, we select for that. But that is probably the most similar sound to a wolf howl in a hunting context. And you have to remember, like, indigenous people knew this stuff way better than we do. There's good ethnography on the Tukadika or the mountain Shoshone that used to live where I live. They trained their dogs to howl like a wolf to get bighorn sheep moving across the landscape so they could hunt them. They'd have people set up, in a different location. So there's this evolution of hunting with dogs or proto-dog goes way back, and we'll never know what those sounds were like, but of course they happened.
That is so cool. Question from Jill. Jill asks, do you think that dogs will keep evolving selectively to bark less? Is dog barking like cat meowing, which is much more likely to be directed at humans?
Right. Certainly, that's something we know about cats, right? That seems to be a completely human oriented aspect. Interestingly enough, this dog is absolutely silent. He does a little bit of whimpering. And so there's definitely individual differences, right? Because Pomeranians in general are quite barky. It's very difficult when there's an evolutionary question to make statements about the future. It's difficult to anticipate what future products are going to look like. We can talk about what we are doing now in terms of selective breeding. If there are individuals who are working on a breed or a lineage of a breed to be more vocal, you can do that through selective breeding, only allowing those individual dogs that are the most vocal to breed, which is why dog breeders are very careful about which individuals they themselves are having it remaining intact. And then also if they are selling their puppies, what those future owners are doing. And usually they're very clear on this is not going to be an animal that will breed. You need to sign that you will spay or neuter because of the idea of maintaining a standard. Evolution is continuously occurring in the natural world, It means shuffling up genetic information. What we are doing with dogs is something called artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, where we are tinkering with what we want in a dog through selective breeding.
Because the aliens, we won't be warned if they, like, I hope we don't select that out of them.
Yeah, that's fair. There are so many great questions here. I see one thing coming up a lot, so I want to make sure we get to it before we run out of time. A lot of folks here are really interested in continuing to follow your research, wondering if we could drop something in the chat, where to follow you, what you're teaching, what you're researching, what papers are coming out. Where's the best place to find you?
You can go to the other questions, but I'll post some links. I don't know if you're posting other links sent to you, but we'll definitely try to do that.
I'm just putting in my website.
Yeah, we will definitely add it to the show notes after the event. No worries there.
Moving on with questions then. Penelope asks, any merit to the idea that the order of howl participation is correlated to rank, and being a smaller canid, the TNG dogs were last in the pecking order?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Dominance hierarchies can be extremely important for so many behaviors, right? And that's exactly where Penelope was going with that. Who's eating first? Who's getting groomed? Who gets access to the shady spot, the coolest water at the end of the pool or whatever. But with regards to vocalizations, it would really depend on the actual vocalization itself. If you're a subordinate animal, right, and you are trying to get your way into, being able to access some scrumptious bone with a bit of tissue on it, maybe you're engaged in some vocal behavior like whining or whimpering. I think the question was going is with regards to maybe a howl. Like, are there certain individuals that are more highly ranked, say the mated pair, right, the bonded so-called alpha pair, that are more likely to initiate a howl? Zeph, have you been seeing that in the data? It's a difficult one because rank itself is very flexible. It changes, and we've all seen very dominant dogs handicap themselves in the presence of a subordinate dog. So rank can be a socially flexible state, right? So that's the other part. But in terms specifically maybe of are the alpha animal most likely to initiate a group chorus? That's the data will bear that out.
I think an more interesting question is that do female wolves impact the rest of the pack to join in on a chorus howl? I see alpha males will often start howl. The simple question is this, like, wolves howl a lot, but they don't always chorus howl. So a chorus howl always starts with a howl. So why doesn't a howl lead to a chorus howl? And does it? And what I'm seeing is that more often than not, it's the alpha female. When she kicks off, the rest of them, I've seen a video where the rest of them turn their head, looked at her, and they howl instantly. Like, as soon as they hear that pitch, they're like, boom, they join in. So sex could be another role. And then social status, my guess is that it's probably very true that dominant wolves have a role in response rates. Another cool one is, like, when we record these puppies at den sites, there's times where all of the wolves leave the den site, especially when the puppies get older. The puppies are just by themselves. I've got these puppy chorus howls where a puppy starts and then the rest of them join in. I would love to follow that puppy through its life. Is that the puppy that's going to become the alpha male or female at some point? What drives that behavior as well? And they're obviously very social animals. So the pups are interacting all the time and they're learning very quickly who's in charge in the group. And so that's another good question. How does their language evolve over their lifetime from youth to adulthood?
We are running low on time, unfortunately, but I wanted to say thank you to Jeff and Joanna. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. It's been really a delight for me. This is the first of these kinds of chats that we're doing here at community.fluent.net, but I hope it's not the last. It would be great to have you all back maybe in a year or so and just to check in on how things are going. I know I've learned an enormous amount here, and I hope everyone participating did as well.
Yeah, thanks for your support and everything you do at Fluent Pet.
You guys are rock stars. And thank you to the audience. for listening.
This has been really wonderful. Thank you both so much for your time. We will be posting an edited version to our YouTube in the coming days.
Dandelion says thank you too.
I love you, Dandelion.
We love you.
I don't know. I don't
Thank-
know.
See y'all.
Bye.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Joanna.
See you later, Dr. Reed.
Bye.